Politics and Prose. We're super happy to have you here for a talk about the other side of prospect. Came out just less than a week ago, so hot off the press, as it were, and we're super excited about it. My name is Wendy Wasserman. I'm the head of marketing here at Politics and Prose. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping things. Obviously, the first one is please turn off your phone. You're welcome to take pictures, do whatever you want, but let's try to keep the ringing at a minimum. If you can help us afterwards with the chairs, just folding up the chairs, and that way we can put the store back together after the event. The way that this is going to go, and the way that we do all of our events, if you're familiar with them, is we bring out the author and a moderator, in this case, Nicholas and Kevin, to have a little chat. They'll talk for about 25, 30 minutes, 20 minutes, a lot of ish in there, followed by questions and answers. We have a mic over here behind the white pillar in the back. There's a pillar, but then there's a mic on the other side. We're going to ask that if you have questions, and we please invite you for questions, that you come up here and ask your question through the mic. That's for a few reasons. Most of all, so these guys can hear it, but also because we are live streaming tonight and we want to be able to capture your question for the live stream and for taping. Got it? Makes sense? Okay, good. And the most important part, right? How could I forget the most important part, which is buy the book. We have it up at the register for sale. Look, it even says in really big letters here, buy the book. I almost forgot that part. Buy the book. We have it at the register for sale, as I said, and Nicholas afterwards will be doing signings, and I'm happy to personalize the book for you. So, as I was saying, The Other Side of Prospect, which came out less than a week ago, was listed by the New York Times as one of the 15 nonfiction books of the fall and one of LitHub's most anticipated books for 2022. It was also one of my staff picks. We as staff here get to read advanced copies and then blurb them, so I was really happy to be able to blurb this and meet Nicholas. I really think this book is of 3 books in one, really about the American experience. In first ways, it's a social commentary about racism's omnipresence. It's a true crime story about a senseless neighborhood murder. And it's also an intimate account of a young black man trying to get his life back after 9 years in prison. And all of this is happening only a stone's throw away from Yale's idyllic campus in New Haven. You know, we've all heard that they say your zip code shouldn't decide your destiny, and in this case I find it really amazing what just a few streets can make. So Nicholas Dawidoff was spent a lot of time researching this book. He is also the critically acclaimed author of 5 other books, including The Catcher Was a Spy and In the Country of a Country. He's also a Pulitzer Prize finalist. And he will be in conversation today with Kevin Young, who is the Andrew W. Mellon Director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. In his spare time, like he has any, he is the poetry editor of The New Yorker, where he hosts the poetry podcast. Nicholas, Kevin, you guys back there? Come on out. Nicholas, we're going to have you here.
How's it going? Good to see everyone. Thanks for coming out. It's so good to see you. I haven't seen Nikki in a while, but we're old friends, so we're really going to have a conversation, and Nikki's going to read a little bit from this beautiful book. I thought I'd start by what brought you to this book. In a way, you returned to New Haven after some years away. Tell us about that. What was that process of deciding, hey, I want to write this account, as you put it, I think so well, of 3 books in one?
It's such a pleasure to do this with you, and there are just a few people I want to mention really quickly before I answer your question. I just want to say that if you spend over 8 years and talk to over 500 people on a book, you run up a lot of debts, and I just really want to mention the Art for Justice Foundation, which was created by Agnes Gund to change society for the better and bring an end to mass incarceration. And projects like mine are so grateful to the Art for Justice Foundation. I also couldn't have done this without, I just mentioned a few people who are sort of DC people or DC affiliates who were so helpful to me, and I'll just say really quickly, Monica Bell and Dina Fisher and Jamie Wright and Brian Goldstein and Stuart Levy and Annette Levy and Tom Yelm and Matt Clam and Thomas Hargrove and Sheila Thorne Edmonds, whose family owned, this book is set in a community in New Haven called Newhallville, and her family owned, there were many barbershops, but her family owned the most wonderful barbershop on Newhall Street in Newhallville. And in this book, I would say really the main character is the neighborhood. And here, what makes a neighborhood is many things, but one of the things that really made Newhallville were all the wonderful shops and local institutions that were owned by people everybody knew, and the shop owners knew their people, and that's certainly politics and Prose's role in this community. So I'm always just so grateful to local independent bookstores, both for what they do as booksellers, but also what they do to foster community. I always, bring along my spontaneous remarks, Kevin.
I noticed.
It's been going fun. Well, you
should see how long the acknowledgments are in the book.
My acknowledgments always have to be cut. So I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut. I think I would have grown up in Washington, D.C. That's where I was living when my dad fell apart as a person, and we had to leave very quickly, and we came back to New Haven. My mother, my sister, and I, when we were very young, and we were there because my dad had been a graduate student in New Haven. My mom got her old job back, and so she was a single mom, and she could only work part-time because she had kids. So her life was a little bit straightened, and so she slept on the couch, and the pull-out, and I would hear her at night, through my wall, worrying about things like, how am I going to make the rent and stuff like that. In our neighborhood in New Haven, New Haven's a city of neighborhoods. Many people would say that New Haven's a more compressed version of many American cities, in that for such a small place, it's remarkably diverse, and yet it is remarkably segregated. It is a place that I got to know because of baseball. As a kid, I rode my bicycle all over the city to go to baseball leagues, and that's where I really saw my city. And one of the places I went to was a field called Bowen Field, where I have a very strong memory of the day in my early teens when I'm standing out on the field, and Bowen Field is in Newhallville, or basically on the fringe of Newhallville. And if you play baseball as a kid, you know everybody. You know the kids you're playing with, you know the kids you're playing against, you know all the people who come to games and things like that. And I could tell that compared, tell in the way that, kids, you don't talk about these things, but I could tell that my mom might have her struggles, but they were nothing compared to the struggles of some of the people I was growing up with and playing baseball with. And it was really confusing to me. And I remember the day that I was standing out there on this, dusty field, and I'm looking out, sort of beyond the backstop, and right there is Yale University. Just beyond, it's a walk. And here are these kids around me who are, they're my friends, and they seem, just as promising. And so paradise for young people, and right here are people who are, have a lot of struggle. And it was confusing as a child. And I just thought, how can this be? I can remember thinking that, why should this be, And I guess that's where the book comes from. It comes from being a child, and I feel as though I thought about it all my, the rest of my life. I'd come back and see my mom, and the dichotomy between the two New Havens only increased. There'd always be articles in the New York Times talking about the two New Havens, the two Americas. And I felt as though this was just something, when I was experienced enough to handle something that felt to me very complex. To me, it felt like 4 books in one, but it felt,
Sure.
Yeah, so that's where it comes from.
Well, what's the 4th book? But I have some ideas, because I think there was also this real, it's not even compact, but a sort of illustrative history of the Great Migration, for instance, and the life and death, let's call it, of an American city. And I think those two things were really powerful to me, especially in the first section, because the book has these great bookends, but has these kind of almost portraits of different individuals. And one is Pete, who you tell the story of so beautifully, but it's really the story of this place in South Carolina that all of the characters, and I'm calling them characters, but they're real life people, we understand that. All the figures in your book come from basically the same part of the world, which I hadn't really realized. And you really do a tremendous job, and I'm not just saying that because you're my friend, of tracing this interwoven community that, in a way comes from South Carolina, comes from, frankly, stories that I grew up with. My family's from Louisiana, of stolen land, threats, sort of things that displaced people to this part of New Haven. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about Pete as a way of talking about some of that.
I can. I just have to say it's really wonderful to do this with you. All of us who knew Kevin when we were really good friends, and he was making his way from, we go see him in Athens, Georgia, and Bloomington, and then we go to, eventually Boston and then New York. And it's really moving and gratifying when somebody who you think really deserves it does really well in life. And all his friends are very proud of him, and we always want to say and strut around and brag about him. So anyway.
Thanks.
That's something I noticed. As a child, something I didn't notice that I only noticed later was that New Haven has more South Carolina license plates than any place I've ever been except South Carolina. The whole city, it's just people are driving around, and the connection between primarily South Carolina, but also North Carolina, there's Virginia, Georgia. New Haven, in many ways, is the history of American immigration. It starts in the mid-19th century, and every major wave of immigration that comes through the East Coast of the United States comes through New Haven. And the reason people are coming is for jobs. First, it's a carriage factory, and then it's the gun factory, and they're wonderful.
And they're the same. I mean, you trace how these gun manufacturing companies started as something else.
Right. They started as a shirt factory, and then he turned to guns. And one of the great ironies of New Haven.
It's very American.
One of the ironies of New Haven is when the gun factory was flourishing, there was absolutely no gun violence and no real crime worth mentioning at all in New Hallville. And trouble always comes when the work disappears. But the waves of migration are, it's Irish migration and then Italian and Eastern European and German. And then the last one is the migration of African Americans coming for the same reason everybody else did, up from the South. And for the if you split it into two generations, the first generation does exactly the same. The New Hallville, where that barber shop was a flourishing place and a source of mobility and uplift, just like every other immigrant generation. And Pete Fields, who is the someone who comes from a small farming community in South Carolina, lives in New Hallville. His family buys his first house. They move up and out. He eventually has one nice house and then an even nicer house in a community outside New Haven. But if you come after the work disappears, that's, again, when things become more complicated. And Pete is someone who loves his community, as many people who grew up there did, the way people so often want to go home again. And he would go home again to play cards in a local sort of gathering place for what he called the Carolina Homeboys. And it was a place where people would, play cards and, talk junk and talk about childhood and all the things that, is primarily men.
I love the name of this place.
It's called the Mud Hole.
And it's named after a spill that happens, and it's a literal mud hole that people fish in, and then suddenly later it's a place people do other kinds of fishing.
Yeah, some pipe burst in this expanse of land that is near where the club would be it gets very muddy. And the club members seize upon this opportunity, and they dig it out and they fill it with fish, and they're all going fishing there. And I don't know how much fishing Pete actually was doing. Right. He was more of a card player, but a lot of them would go fishing.
But fishing doesn't involve much fishing. My father was being a fishing person. So anyway, continue.
No, so Pete, like many men who are successful people who'd grown up in New Hallville, would come back on the weekends. And they come in their big, beautiful cars. A lot of them had just lovely cars. Certainly he did. And they would park along Shelton Avenue, and they go into the mud hole and they play cards. But it was Pete's misfortune to... was an old school guy. He liked to carry a lot of cash around, and he'd get his checks, and he'd have a big, thick wallet, and he'd go around and pay his bills in cash and so forth. And somebody heard about this. And so one day he's on a gloomy side street. He's a widower at this point. He's waiting for his new girlfriend to come downstairs, and some kids run up on him, and he gets shot. And basically the story really begins with his life. But if you unpack what basically the story amounts to is you are unpacking one brief, fleeting, violent act, and you can see so much American history in it. And that's really what the story amounts to.
Well, how did that strike you? I mean, that must have been really strange to know of this crime. Was that the first thing you knew? You knew about the crime from back then, or you knew about it sort of more recently, and then you knew about the sort of other injustices? Because, of course, it isn't just that injustice, which is terrible, and you describe it so beautifully, but it's a little like thinking about something like In Cold Blood, which is using a crime to think about the American psyche. Tell us more about how'd you wrestle with that question with this horrible murder?
Right. So we're living in New York City, and I decide I just feel as though this juxtaposition in New Haven is something I've seen all over the country. You could see it in Washington, you could see it in Boston, you could see it in Philadelphia, you could see it in Baltimore. It is an American phenomenon, and New Haven seems to me like a wonderful place to talk about something awful, or at least something very, very complicated. So we moved back to New Haven, and I started looking for a story. Because as much as you might want to talk about things as an idea, you can't really interest people in it unless you're telling a story, which is my job. So, but I'm hunting around for a story, and one day I get a call from a lawyer, and this lawyer says, "Hey, New Haven's a small town. He's heard about me. He has this client, and his client is a young person, he says, who grew up in Newhallville, whose personal experience, he says, from everything that he's heard about me, would be interesting to me." So comes a snowy day in February, and I go to his office, which is on the attic of a law firm, and he's up there, and I think he's in sweatpants and a dirty t-shirt, and he's always working on Sundays, and there are boxes, he's up in the eaves with all these boxes. He's looking at these boxes. So I started looking at these boxes, and it is this legal case, and it is about this young person from this neighborhood who's sent to prison for 38 years at age 16 for something that the lawyer insists he didn't commit. A crime he didn't commit. Now, I have no way of knowing this, but if it's true or not. But what I do know is true instantly is that it is a fact of American communities that depending upon where you grow up, how isolated you are, how much attention you're receiving, many other things, you may be more vulnerable to all sorts of things, including, harried and hurried policing. And that is what the lawyer says happened to this young man whose name is Bobby. And so I look through the files and I say, well, I would like to meet your client. And I go to meet him. And then over time, over the next year, the Department of Corrections gets interested in this. And they allow me to go see him as many times as I want. And so I go to meet this young person named Bobby. And I'm instantly interested in him because he is so observant. He's not only observant, but he's also compassionate. And he's patient. And it strikes me as that he's also really candid, which seems really an irony to me, given that he's been coerced into a false confession. That such a truthful person would go to prison for being untruthful seems like something I really want to know more about. And so through him, I begin to meet his family and his broader community. I come to know members of Pete's family. I come to know members of the family that is associated with the kid who probably really did it. And then after a year, suddenly I get a call from the lawyer, and Bobby's being set free. And a woman named Dina Fisher, who I think is here, you can meet her, reviews for the state Bobby's case, which is what the lawyer always calls it. And she, as many other people, found that it wasn't a good case. And so then Bobby is set free. But now Bobby is out in the world as a person who spent more than half his life in prison. And he is expected to suddenly be an adult, and not only be an adult, be a person who can go out and find a job when he doesn't really have any skills. And life is really, really challenging for him. And it's so poignant for me at that point and going forward that life would be so challenging for him, because as a child, he was known for being so perceptive and observant. He's the kid in his community, which is very rare, but which, as you'll be able to tell, was very moving to me. He's the kid who would leave his neighborhood on his bicycle, come up and over the hill, which is the street that is called Prospect Hill, and the top of the hill is Prospect Street. He's the kid who comes up and over the hill and looks around. And he's the kid who thinks about sort of what I was thinking about, which makes it clear to me that many people were thinking about this. It wasn't just the two of us. And the story, then unfolds as I come to know Bobby better. I
mean, we could talk all night. I know we want to hear you read. Do you want to ask a couple more questions and then you read both passages you were talking about?
You know, I always just do what you tell me,
yeah.
and life goes better that way.
I mean, if only. You'd be the only one on earth. So, two things. One of the things that really struck me was Bobby, who is a great character. And in a way, but in the beginning, I started to think of him as kind of a writer himself, just that observant quality you created. And then while he's in prison, he's in a reading group, which sounds really fascinating. And I just loved how literary it was, and also how much it kind of influenced, I don't know, how he thought about himself. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, Bobby is a kid who went to schools where he didn't get a particularly good education. He's part of this is actually a very common thing among kids who are parentified when they're very young. He had many siblings, and he's the oldest child in the household, and so he has great responsibilities beginning at age 8 for cooking meals, getting his younger siblings off to school, putting them to bed, and things like that. And so school becomes the time when he has some time to goof off, you know, when he's has some freedom. And so he is not, even though all his teachers who I talked with thought he was a really promising student and a fully admirable person, they, you know, he was not distinguishing himself in school. And it's one of the ironies of someone who grew up in a city where one of the greatest colleges, universities in the world, one of the ironies is that he doesn't really become educated until he goes to prison. And when he goes to prison, part of how he gets educated is because he has wonderful teachers there. And then he also has wonderful sort of amateur teachers who are older men who are in prison for a very, very long time, whose second chance at life is to help this really suffering individual. And one of the ways that they suffer, one of the ways that they help him overcome his suffering is that they read with him. And together they create book clubs. And there at one point were 7 people, and they read, you know, they read Richard Wright, and they read James Baldwin, and they read these books in their cells. And then when they have free time, during rec, they come out and they sit there and they talk about them, and they talk about it in a particularly rigorous way. And the conversation is pointed for Bobby because they want him to extract lessons from what he's reading so he'll have a better experience out in the world. And I found this pretty profound, both because it's like what we hope for from books, that they will in one way or another lift people up and make their lives deeper and more profoundly informed. And this was happening for him.
I want to ask one more question, then have you read, and then I might have a question at the end after we open up to audience questions. There's a sign that says questions up there, funny enough. So one of the things I was thinking is you mentioned the defender. I'm sorry. Tell us about him. What a great figure he is in the book. You want to talk about him a little bit?
About Ken?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Ken is, you know, everybody, there isn't one of us who the good things in our life come to us partly because of who we are and a lot because of the help that we get. And Bobby didn't have a whole lot of help in his life, but then he had some really good luck, which is that a lawyer named Ken Rosenthal in New Haven hears about his case, and he can't believe it. One of the things he hears is that Bobby's other alleged co-defendant actually goes to trial, doesn't confess, and is acquitted. So why is Bobby serving 38 years when the trial happens, you know, it's proven that the other guy who was allegedly with him didn't do it? And this bothers Ken, and many things begin to bother Ken. And he commits 5 years of his life not really being paid much at all, if anything, to just working on what he always calls Bobby's case. And his dedication, his clients like to carry around a photograph in their wallet. When Ken works, he works, generally speaking, until midnight. Then he has a little pallet behind his desk, which is this blue, like, exercise mat. It has a little yellow sheet and a pillow. And so he goes to bed.
He sleeps there.
Sleeps there until 4 in the morning, and then he gets up and he goes back to work. So what his clients carry around is not a picture of their lawyer who's trying to save them, but of his sleeping area. And so this is...
He was quite a character in the big sense, because he's like, oh, I hated having to go back to my own bed, he says, eventually when COVID hits or something.
Yeah, he never wants to waste time. So he goes everywhere. Either he runs there or he rides his bicycle as much as he can so that he has...
He's like 70.
He's double tasking, right? He runs like 5 marathons when he's 70, but he trains for it just getting places because he doesn't want to take out time from his work. He's famous for his terrible clothes and for his... his awful cars, which are stained and dented and things, and yet he picks up every check, and he is an incredibly big-hearted person. But he's one of these people who is more fully himself than most people I've ever met, which is to say that nothing about him ever feels in the least bit self-conscious. There's a purity about his desire just to do what he's going to do in the world. And that's not to say that he doesn't rub plenty of people the wrong way, but rubbing people is a little bit how, when you're dealing with someone who's been sent to prison for murder at age 16 and is just disappeared into the Cheshire prison, this is how you get him out. And it's that kind of guy who can do it.
Well, maybe you can read us a little bit of the book, which is such a beautifully written book. And while you're doing that, can you tell us a little bit about Bobby's, I know you're going to read some of it, about Bobby's life after?
Yeah, so I'll read a little passage on what's called, it's a very undervalued sort of, or underknown, I would say, big part of American life, which is prison reentry. So many people are coming out of American prisons, and both state and federal prisons, every day. And yet, how people re-engage with the world, what they do. Bobby went to prison at 16. He comes out of prison at 25, but he's still in effect in worldly experience 16. He's a kid whose priorities when he gets out of prison are any 16-year-old's priorities, and that has to do with dress and other things too. And so I'll read you a little bit about something that happens to him shortly after he comes out of prison.
Yeah, I'll take that one.
Oh, is there another one there?
Yeah.
You don't want me to go double? Okay. One of the things that should be said is that prison pauses life. I think I was saying that. So you just need to know a few things. The name of the detective, one of the 2 detectives who coerced Bobby's false confession, his name's Clarence Willoughby. His alleged co-defendant was a kid named Kwame, whose life was completely destroyed because when Kwame was arrested, he didn't have enough money to bail himself out of prison. So as a 14-year-old, he spent something like 16 months in prison. And when he came out, everybody who knew him said he was just a completely different person. But he was acquitted. And so while Bobby's in prison, Kwame is out. Bobby and Kwame, when they were kids, hung out at a corner store, which was known as the 2-4. It's open 24 hours. And that's where all the action in the neighborhood was. All the young people hung out there. People who are in the game and people who are just around. And Bobby was known as a just around kid. The place where Bobby is in prison is in a place, it's about half an hour away from New Haven. It's called Cheshire, Connecticut. So he's in the Cheshire prison. So now, though, he's come out. And the only other thing I need to tell you is that when Bobby was young, riding around on his bicycle, he called himself a traveler. He said a traveler was someone who wants more experience in the world and who goes around. So Bobby, on his bicycle, moving around New Haven, was a traveler. On any day when Bobby could again be a traveler, moving around, interacting with people, he was at his most optimistic. He wanted his life to permanently open up. Across the difficult first year after prison, the former boy on a bike now made earning his driver's license his top priority. Back when Bobby turned 16, his driver's license wasn't for him a defining American moment or even on his mind. Somebody could always come and get you, he said, or buses or your friend's mom or dad, we'd all pile in. Growing up in a disenfranchised community, many 16-year-olds from Newhallville didn't pursue their licenses at all. Glenn Worthy, the Newhallville native who was principal at the local Hill House High School, said, "When it comes up with kids, they say, 'Hush, Mr. Worthy, I don't want to talk about that now.' Mostly they can't afford it." Beyond the hundreds of dollars it costs to become licensed, many Newhallville families own no vehicle, making it impossible to secure a car in which to learn to drive and then to reach the Department of Motor Vehicles, which was miles away, out in Hamden. There was also the reluctance to fail, sometimes felt by kids who'd already endured many defeats. Bobby's close friend Shay described getting a license as extra stuff. Shay had been 21 and away at college when she finally got hers. She said that for Newhallville kids, there was no driver's ed class offered at Hillhouse High and no way of getting to the high school in Hamden where such courses were held. Perhaps a license wasn't even necessary. Bobby's mother and father hadn't, so far as he knew, ever had licenses. A lot of people were on Prime ride around without licenses, Bobby said. This was a practice known to many in Newhallville as riding or driving dirty. Dirty was versatile slang with many applications. Shay said that everybody she knew growing up was dirty somehow, suspended license, no insurance, car taxes. Let my insurance lapse because it was either phone bill or insurance, food or insurance. Which would you rather pay? Car insurance? That was let me pray. This is a lot of people, and you have to drive to make money at your job, so you take a chance. Bobby was determined. He talked about the driver's license as his golden ticket, said to him, it means the world, because when I have my license, I can get a job outside New Haven where it's safer. Bobby's desire was to be upstanding, not someone who resorted to driving dirty, who remained unlicensed because he'd been in prison. He thought having the license would now finally make him feel liberated. Bobby's cousin Koya helped him to get the formal process started with a learner's permit. She and Granddad gave him a few driving lessons, and then Shay took over. They had glorious times together out on the road. Shay loved to drive, and he did too. 4 months after his release from prison, Shay helped Bobby enroll in an 8-hour accredited course on safe driving practices, where he sat in the back row of the classroom behind all the teenagers and enjoyed learning about the potential on-road dangers of a messy car and about how passenger weight distribution affects turning radius. After completing the course came the qualifying tests, first written, then rode. Bobby went to the DMV in Hamden to take his written examination, and by the time he got to the DMV, he was visibly shaking. The atmosphere at the squat brick DMV building didn't help. With its uniformed guards, stale smell, the dulled faces of all the people standing by, the DMV could have been a correctional institution. Bobby began his test, and soon a question about skids slid him so far off course that he became rattled, rushed through the remaining questions, just so he could get out of that room, get out of that building. He failed the test by 1 point. Afterwards, he could barely speak, he was so crushed. The next available test date in Bobby's part of the state was at the Cheshire DMV in mid-April. He could have waited a few days more and gone to a closer Connecticut town, one where he hadn't been incarcerated, but he was eager to defeat the test, and besides, Bobby felt no need to avoid Cheshire. His time there was someone else's mistake. He began studying the manual, he said, hard. On his second written test day, Bobby arrived at a coffee shop in Cheshire 3 hours before his appointment time, and he prepared like an athlete. He hydrated with water, ate a banana, and limbered up with practice tests. He wanted a victory in Cheshire. He'd all but memorized the manual, but these practice tests ask for knowledge of the specifics of tire alignment and teen curfews, areas outside the manual's coverage. What was up with these non-manual related questions? When Bobby answered one incorrectly, he jumped up, nearly knocking the table over. On the way to the DMV, Bobby passed the prison. The Cheshire DMV was a much smaller building than Hamden had been, and had the hospitable ambiance of a national park welcome center. As he went in, Bobby was making nervous jokes and saying, I'm not nervous, I'm not failing, I got this. His dark 26-year-old face contrasted with the rosy white teenagers who were arriving with their parents for the test. As the woman at the front desk signed him in, she took a practice glance and she said, you'll do fine. Then she advised Bobby, take your time. Once registered, Bobby disappeared down a hallway. 40 minutes later, he emerged, arms raised, roaring, high-fiving, cheesing. His test score had been nearly perfect. There had been several questions identical to those on the practice test. It seemed like all the answers were popping out, he said, speaking in a joyous rush. I'm souped. I'm turned. I'm ecstatic. So soup. From the car, he made calls, left voice messages. Passing the prison again, he brought up Detective Willoughby. I don't bear him any grudges, Bobby said. It's not in my heart to do that. People can do wrong things, and it doesn't make me hate them. I'm just letting people be who they are. Bobby would have to wait 3 months before taking his road test in mid-July. Deferring his wishes he knew how to do, and he was so steadfast about his license preparation, it seemed worrisome to think what would happen when there was no longer the upcoming road test to organize his life. He enjoyed practicing with Shay, she warning, it's no more smooth sailing church drivers today, Bobby. Don't let anybody break your flow. Which was not to say Bobby wanted the process to last. I can taste it, he said. When I pass, I'm going to cry. You'll see tears. The day before the road test in July 2016, Bobby drove around the city, practicing what he judged were his weaknesses. He reminded himself to check his mirrors every 5 seconds, to note the speed limit, to place his hands 6 hours apart on the wheel. Near the 2-4, he said, "We were sitting there by the 2-4 when they pulled me off the porch and arrested me. It was raining." Then he beeped a greeting explaining that was Kwame and them. Kwame's group was out there every day now. Bobby drove so well you could forget he was practicing. Then, when he made a small error, forgetting to signal for a lane change, his hands trembled from wanting something so much. The next day, the weather was hot, bright, and clear. After all the waiting, everything happened very fast. A large graying white man in sunglasses, a blue agency issue polo shirt, and the blue khakis approached Bobby. The man looked like a country boy state trooper, and it turned out Bobby's examiner was a retired suburban police officer. He asked Bobby to get into the driver's seat, to turn on the car's ignition, to use his turn indicators, first the right, then the left, to press the brake pedal. As the car crept out of the parking lot, Bobby signaled left, and something in the air lifted.
How beautiful. I want to have the audience ask some questions. What questions do you have? Please come up to
Yeah, so up here, someone's got to be first.
if you can come to the mic just for, it's right behind this thing. You might not be able to see it if you're back there.
I guess I'll go first. First of all, thank you. I look forward to reading this a lot. I spent my 4 years on the other side of the hill at Yale. I think I only went to New Hallville probably on a bike ride once or twice and to do a Habitat for Humanity project. But I'm curious, as a writer who grew up there, how much different do you think this book was than if you hadn't grown up there? How did that influence you? And for the better, but also did you have some preconceived notions that turned out weren't true as you did the research and spent more time living there?
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's part of being a human being that you have preconceived notions about things you don't know. I mean, we think fast and slow. We come to conclusions with what limited information we have. So I guess I would say that, you know, one of the wonderful things about my job is I get to spend a lot of time with new people for every project. And one of the beautiful things about that is that the world keeps opening up to you in new ways. And I don't think I've had a project where I felt the world opened up more to me, that people were so, I mean, this is what I was writing about was, I was not surprised exactly, but this is something a lot of people are thinking about, and a lot of people, it's on their minds, and they thought it was as strange as I did. And I began just collecting people's reactions to how people felt as they crossed over, people from both sides of the hill. It's called the other side of Prospect. That's an allusion to The Other America, which is one of Dr. King's greatest speeches. But, you know, to each side, the other side is the other side. And this is for some people don't pay much attention to it, but that's very few people. Most people know about this. And it's like me as a kid, it's kind of in the back of their mind until you express it either to yourself or others. And everybody had stories, and everybody felt confused by it because these are big American problems we're talking about. This is something that's persisted over generations, my whole lifetime. And if it was easy to solve and easy to grapple with a post-industrial solution, then it would have been done. But in the meantime, it creates a sort of pulsing, pulsing kind of confusion about why this should be and that it exists, and it creates a lot of emotion. And for me, anyway, that emotion is tied to a big subject of the book, which is violence. Because I spent a lot of time talking with people about violence. I talked with people who committed violence, who were in prisons. I talked with police officers. I talked with scholars and, professors who study it. And one of the things I came to see is, and this is true of the whole book, if there's one lesson of this book, it's that everything is complicated, and that we get into trouble as a people when we try too hastily to uncomplicate things. But one of the things I began to think about violence in a community, the way I began to think about it was as, first of all, I should say that very, very few people commit violence, right? That it is just, it's like grizzly bears or sharks, great white sharks. It takes only a few in a community for everybody to be scared. And this is what violence really does more than anything. It's the most pernicious thing is that everybody is really frightened. Of course, the most pernicious thing is that people die, but for an entire community is affected in that way. And so much, I'm beginning to ramble here, and I'll pull myself back in. But I mean,
it's a big book. It's fact.
Yeah, this is one of the real challenges of writing a book like this, is that each subject modifies the next subject, and you're moving around, and you finally have to just take out 100 index cards with every subject on it, and you put them on the floor in your office, and you move them around till they look like a railroad train with different boxcars, and that's how you organize it.
Well, but I think the part of the question that I want to hear the answer to is how you coming back, like as a writer. I mean, I know some of the answer, but did you feel like it changed you writing this book?
Oh, fundamentally. I mean, every project changes you, but no project changed me more than this one, because I was talking with people who are living such extremes. And what I would say about violence is that it is the most extreme expression of different kinds of emotions that many people feel. Very few people commit it. Most people who, instead of violence, might do other things to express frustration or anger or hopelessness or the many things that lead to it. They might do perfectly happy things, like they might express it through love or through family or through parenting. Others might drink or use drugs. I mean, it's a myriad of things. But for me, yeah, I mean, coming back, this is just, I guess, the most particular thing that I began to think about over and over again is I always knew things in life were complicated, but to me, I paid much more attention to how everything is complicated. And always I wanted to be aware in myself how little I knew about so many things, how hard it is. The more you know how little you know. And that was true for me.
Hi, I wanted to, you alluded at the beginning to the fact that despite your mother's difficulties, you were from the wealthier side of Prospect Street. And I'm just curious, how were your inquiries and interest in this topic received by the community you were studying?
People were. I began every interview for this book by telling people some version of what I told you. I told people about myself. I told them what I was hoping to do, who I was, why, and said that you could ask me anything. And then we would have conversations, and the only people who really didn't want to talk with me were either people who were in one way or another probably, and they didn't talk to me, so I can only assume, ashamed, like one of the two police officers who coerced the confession didn't want to talk to me. Bobby had an unfortunate first lawyer. He didn't want to talk to me. So I talked to people who knew them as much as possible, because you're characterizing people's lives, right? And so you want to be as thorough as possible. But then what I did at the end of every conversation, I said was, well, we've had a long conversation and we've talked about a lot of things. And you don't get many opportunities to write about these things. They persist in part because, let's just face it, not everybody cares. So this is my chance, and I really want to do it as well as I can. And so I need you to criticize me. I need you to tell me where I'm going wrong. If my tone is wrong, if I said anything that rubbed you the wrong way, if anything about my facts seemed askew, just tell me. And so people, people were, it was my good fortune. People were really receptive. But I think it was partly because, I hope making myself vulnerable to them.
You have amazing quotes throughout. I mean, it's really impressive how you gathered, both evidence, but also this kind of account of these histories, these personal histories. It's really beautiful. Another question.
Yeah. Hi. So I studied at Harvard, and I work at Yale now. I will say that there is something very kind of particularly, I think, kind of sinister about the way that Yale creates a fortress around itself, really to keep the New Haven community away. It's heavily, securitized. It's heavily policed. And I think there's a real kind of intentionality behind creating this sharp distinction between who is of New Haven and who is of Yale. And I was thinking a little bit about the imagery that you created for us at the outset of this conversation around sort of, the baseball game that was happening and just looking over the hill at opportunity at Yale. And I just worry a little bit about about this belief system that there is something inherently sort of good and right and truthful about what could lie theoretically for the people that live on the other side of the hill and what doesn't because of structural and systemic racism and other forms of oppression. So I guess what I wanted to ask you is, like, what is true to you about this book? Like, what are you leaving this book project with a real kind of firm belief in, despite the complexities that you drew out from this discussion? Because there is something evil, I think, about Yale and the university and some of its behavior toward residents of New Haven and around New Haven, almost all Black people and Black communities.
Well, you've said a lot of things, and one thing I would say about New Haven is that it's a place where Yale is now the great institution, and there isn't any Winchester left. So it's really primarily just Yale, which is the transcendent institution. And the people that I know in New Haven and who I've talked to, everybody would like to love Yale. You really want to be proud of this long-standing place that is there's so much to celebrate in our country about our greatest universities. And to be sure, those universities do many great things. But one thing I think you're right that we can say is that many of those universities, and it's far from just Yale, you can look in universities all across the country, you can see that there are struggles for the universities which are so close to very different life experiences in their backyard who don't really seem that interested in it. And that's just the history, that's just facts. And I guess my feeling that I took away is that it would be so much in Yale's best interest to do, in answer to your question, what I would most hope for, which is a community where these barriers are more porous, where everybody feels more a part of a community, where everybody has more of a chance. And the big thing that always really confused me about Yale is that given where it was, and that given that an institution like Yale's business, it's a nonprofit institution, its business is its community, its business is sort of public spirit, why wouldn't there be things like an enormous Institute for Post-Industrial Studies, which examines the problems of American communities, specifically the one in its backyard, and tries to do something better about it? And when I talk to people at Yale, and I really also want to say that Yale's a big place, and like any big institution, there's a real spectrum of people who are part of it. I met many, many people who have tried through the years to do wonderful things as representatives of a university for community. But we can also say that there are individuals, and then there are problems that are bigger than the mass of individuals, and that it takes an institution to really engage. And it's meaningful to people in a city when the big institutions show they care. And I think ultimately, I would agree with you that I think places like Yale can do a better job of showing that they can care. And one way that they can do it, I also think it's their obligation as nonprofit institutions, but that's just my opinion. But I would also say that one certainly way that they can do it is that they can contribute what they do best, which is research and education, to thinking about the struggles.
Well said.
So, how would you describe your relationship with Bobby and how it evolved over time and what that meant for the book?
Great question.
That's a good question. A writer and subject is always going to be complicated, especially as the writer begins to write. And I was always conscious that I had met someone who was at such a vulnerable position. And while he said, I mean, he was, as Ken Rosenthal always talked about him being just an ideal client, because he just worked with Ken in a way that Ken felt that he could do the most for him. But my job is not to do for Bobby. My job is to do for my reader. And that creates a real complicated moral compass for a writer. And it also just creates a lot of heartache when you are watching somebody go through something truly terrible at times, going through a tremendous amount of personal pain. And when you are seeing this, you want to help. But you also realize, as he realized, that the point of doing this is to show in a representative way how one person's struggles come to exemplify many people's struggles. And that was misery for me. I've never slept less while I was working on a project. Fortunately for Bobby, over time he came through and he received compensation from the state, which means at least financially his life is in pretty good order. But just because your life is in good order financially doesn't take away from the miserable experience you've been through, the ruining experiences, Dwayne Betts likes to say. Prison ruined him. And I don't think Bobby is ruined, but I do think he was transformed by prison. So we see each other, we text and so forth, but there is something, I don't know how to describe this exactly. There is something just so painful about having a sense, because you really know the facts of somebody's life, having a sense of the joy and fulfillment that you could see someone having in their life, and seeing it more as something where he is still a lot of the time up against it, and I mean emotionally.
Well, you take us on such a journey. It's so beautiful, and you really present these people in their complexity, as everyone heard tonight. Thank you so much. People should come and sign books and do their thing. You will sign the book, sorry. Get their book signed.
You can sign them too.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming out.
Yeah, thank you so much.
We're going to set Nicholas up for some signing. And if you don't mind, if you could help us with the chairs, that would be super helpful. Thank you all for coming out.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.